What's up, Man Fans? I'm your host, Josh Black, and this is the Man Fans Fantasy Football Podcast. Hit me up on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF, or over on YouTube, you can check out our brand new video series, Draftkings Fantasy Locks. It's a short video designed to help you guys get started building your lineups, and I'll put a link to our channel in the description box below. NFL Week 2 is upon us, and Man Fans know what time it is. It's time to get down to business with that Week 2 Draftkings Fantasy Preview. As always, I'm going to give you my top plays for Sunday's main slate. We'll break down every position using DraftKings pricing, Pro Football Focus statistics, and betting lines by Bovada. Let's start under center. In quarterback, it's usually a value position for me, but not this week. Based on the pricing, you're probably going to have to pay up for top 5 production. So why not splurge on Baltimore Ravens quarterback Lamar Jackson? Baltimore's at Houston and a 7-point favorite. Jackson's priced at $8,200 on DraftKings and projected for 25.3 fantasy points. Now, I talked Jackson up last week, and he didn't disappoint. 275 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and another 45 yards rushing on the ground. This week, he draws another beatable matchup against the Texans' defense. They currently allow the 20th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Last week, the Chiefs' offense made him look pretty bad. Patrick Mahomes averaged 9 yards per completion, and he threw for 3 touchdowns. Really, the only reservation I have about playing Lamar this week is that this game could be a blowout. But Baltimore smashed Cleveland in Week 1, and Jackson played well into the fourth quarter. As far as I'm concerned, Lamar is a cash game free space until that salary gets over $9K. You can fire him up this week. Buffalo Bills quarterback Josh Allen. Buffalo's at Miami and a 6-point favorite. DraftKings has him priced at $6,700 and he's projected for 20 fantasy points. I talked about this guy earlier in the week. Allen was impressive against the Jets. 33 completions, 312 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks. Plus another 57 rushing yards. And that rushing floor is what puts him in play for me this week. Miami's defense ranks 28th against opposing quarterbacks. Last week, Cam Newton proved they can't stop the bootleg. He got him for 2 rushing touchdowns, and that's what I like to see for a mobile quarterback like Josh Allen. He doesn't usually hit that 300-yard passing bonus, but I like him for at least 200 through the air, 50 on the ground, and a couple scores. He's a safe bet for 3 times cost per point this week. Other quarterbacks worth a look in Week 2. Arizona Cardinals' Kyler Murray at home against Washington. He's $6,100 on DraftKings, projected for 19.2 fantasy points, but that play does come with some serious blowout risk. And I also like Los Angeles Chargers' Tyrod Taylor at home against Kansas City. He's priced at $5,300, projected for 19.7 fantasy points, and this is purely a game script play because Tyrod looked pretty pedestrian last week against Cincinnati. Let's continue. It's time to talk about the running backs this week. And for me, this is the value spot on the Week 2 main slate. I've got my eye on a couple guys in the 5K range that are locked into workhorse roles. But if you want to go with one of these top price running backs, I think it's got to be Dallas Cowboys' Ezekiel Elliott. He's on the road at Atlanta this week, and Dallas is favored by 4.5. Zeke's at $8,200 on DraftKings and projected for 19.4 fantasy points. Dude is a top of the food chain, true 3-down running back. Last week against the Rams, he had 96 rushing yards and a score. 3 catches, 31 yards receiving, and another score. Dude's a beast. And I'm sure he's drooling over Atlanta's butter-soft rush defense. They allow the 27th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Last week, Seattle's Chris Carson really did some damage catching balls out of the backfield. He hauled in all 6 of his targets for 45 yards and 2 scores. So I expect Zeke to do similar things this week. If the Cowboys get him involved in the passing game early on, they should be able to get out to a lead, and then they can pound the rock with Elliott in the second half. I mean, we could be looking at 30-plus fantasy points this week, and that's well worth the cost of admission. Indianapolis Colts running back Jonathan Taylor. He's at home against Minnesota, and Indy's a 3-point favorite. Taylor's priced at $5,700 on DraftKings and projected for 14.2 fantasy points. And thanks to Marlon Mack's Achilles injury, Taylor's in the driver's seat this week. His rushing numbers weren't impressive out of the gate, 22 yards on 9 attempts. but he showed out as a receiver, catching all 6 of his targets for 67 yards. And this week, Taylor squares off against a Vikings defense that ranks 16th against opposing running backs. They let up a combined 158 rushing yards to Green Bay in Week 1. Aaron Jones averaged 4 yards per carry and hit pay dirt. Next man up, Jonathan Taylor. He'll have an expanded role this week, probably 15 to 20 rushing attempts, and considering how much Phillip Rivers likes to check down, 5 or 6 targets in the passing game should be no problem. You can lock him in. Denver Broncos running back Melvin Gordon. Denver's at Pittsburgh this week and a 7.5-point dog. Melvin's priced at $5,200 on Draftkings and projected for 14.4 fantasy points. And usually, I wouldn't recommend a running back whose team is such a big underdog. But backup running back Phillip Lindsay's out this week, and it's going to be the Melvin Gordon show. We all know this guy can be an elite level fantasy back, and in his first game with the Broncos, he had 78 rushing yards, 3 catches, and a touchdown. This week, it's a shiesty matchup against the Steelers' number 2 ranked rush defense. They absolutely stifled Saquon Barkley last week. But Gordon has some big playability, and the volume's going to be there. He's a cash game staple for me this week. Other running backs I like in Week 2, Tennessee Titans Derrick Henry's at home against Jacksonville, $7,900 on DraftKings, projected for 20.9 fantasy points, and he should see plenty of volume in a game where the Texans are favored by 7.5. And on the other side of the ball, I like the Jacksonville Jaguars running back James Robinson on the road at Tennessee, $4,400 on DraftKings, projected for 11.1 fantasy points. And homeboy looked good last week. The Jags like his 3-down skill set, and I think he's a fantastic salary saver at $4,400. Let's shift gears and talk about my top wide receiver plays for the Week 2 main slate. There's no doubt about it, the top of the pricing is going to be chalky AF. Adams and Hopkins are going to be popular plays, and rightly so. But I think we can avoid some ownership, save some money, and still come up big by drafting Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Julio Jones. Atlanta's at Dallas this week and a 4.5-point dog. Jones is priced at $7,400 on DraftKings and projected for 19.6 fantasy points. Julio put the league on notice last week. Dude is still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. 9 catches on 12 targets for 157 receiving yards. And this week, it's a mid-pack matchup for Jones. The Cowboys allow the 18th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they're definitely beatable. Robert Woods looked good against him last time out, posting 6 catches for 105 yards. Now I expect Atlanta to follow that lead and exploit the mismatch between Julio and cornerback Trayvon Diggs. Pro Football Focus has that rated as a 43% advantage matchup. I think this is going to be a popular game for fantasy purposes. The 53.5-point over-under is the highest implied total on the slate. And if the Falcons are going to be playing from behind, you'll want Julio Jones in your lineup. Los Angeles Rams wide receiver Cooper Kupp. The Rams are at Philly this week and a 1-point dog. Kupp's priced at $6,700 on DraftKings and projected for 13.7 fantasy points. Last week was a fantasy dud for Kupp. 4 catches, 40 yards. But his 5 targets was second best on the team, and I think he's in a nice spot to bounce back this week. The Eagles have allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers so far, and that's in part to big play cornerback Darius Slay. But Robert Woods is going to draw the shadow coverage from Slay this week, so I expect Cooper Kupp to eat. And chances are, ownership's going to be pretty low. Kupp's coming off a disappointing performance, and his price jumped $400. The soft matchup and low ownership make Cooper Kupp my favorite GPP play at wide receiver this week. Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Amari Cooper. He's at home against Atlanta. Dallas is a 4.5-point favorite. Cooper's priced at $6,300 on DraftKings and projected for 15.6 fantasy points. Amari paid off nicely last week, 10 catches for 81 yards. He was by far the most heavily targeted Cowboys receiver, drawing 14 targets. Nobody else on the team had more than 6. And this week, he draws the juicy matchup. The Falcons allow the 26th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In Week 1, all the Seattle pass catchers got a piece, combining for 322 receiving yards and scoring 4 touchdowns. Now I'm expecting Cooper to be heavily involved again this Sunday. 10 plus targets, 100 receiving yards, and a great chance to hit pay dirt. You can lock him in. If you need to save some money at wide receiver this week, you came to the right place, because I've got 3 guys for you. Los Angeles Chargers Mike Williams at home against Kansas City. He's priced at $4,200, projected for 13.9 fantasy points, and he should be heavily targeted as the Chargers are big-time home dogs. Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver Scotty Miller at home against Carolina. He's $4,100 on DraftKings, projected for 10.2 fantasy points, and he's definitely in play with Chris Godwin doubtful for this game. And lastly, we got the Tennessee Titans wide receiver Adam at home against Jacksonville, $3,400 on DraftKings, projected for 10.2 fantasy points, and he's in a prime spot with A.J. Brown out this week. Moving right along, let's dive into my top tight end plays this week. And we're back to pricing I feel better about. Last week, it was hard to pay down at the position, but I don't see that being a problem in week 2. So let's get this party started with Los Angeles Chargers tight end Hunter Henry. He's at home against Kansas City. The Chargers are a 9-point dog. Henry's priced at $5,100 and projected for 12.2 fantasy points. Last week, Henry led all Chargers pass catchers with 5 catches for 73 yards. And this week, he'll see a Chiefs defense that ranks 25th against opposing tight ends. In week 1, Houston's tight ends combined for 4 catches on their 4 targets for 58 yards and a score. So I expect Henry to pick up where they left off. He should be able to make good on that $5,100 salary with catches and yardage alone. If he finds the end zone, we're talking 4 times cost per point. Denver Broncos tight end Noah Fant. Denver's at Pittsburgh this week and a 7.5-point dog. Fant's priced at $4,400 on DraftKings and projected for 10 fantasy points. Last week, Fant lit up the box score, 5 catches, 81 yards, and a touchdown. This week, he's going to have his work cut out for him. The Steelers' defense allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. They held Evan Ingram in check on Monday Night Football, allowing only 2 catches for 9 yards to the Giants' big man. But I don't care. The game script should work in Fant's favor. Denver should be playing from behind, and that means mucho targets for Noah Fant. Plus, this guy has tremendous upside. He averages like 14 yards per catch, and he's due for some positive touchdown regression. If you're playing GPPs this week, Noah Fant's your guy. If you need to go really cheap at tight end, I like the New York Jets' Chris Herndon at home against San Francisco. He's priced at $3,400 on DraftKings, projected for 11.8 fantasy points, and the Jets are going to be without Jamison Crowder against the Niners, so I expect Herndon to pick up some of that slack. He's a safe bet to hit value this week. Let's round out the Week 2 DraftKings fantasy preview with my top play at defense and special teams. Now, it looks like the 49ers and the Cardinals are going to be the chalk at defense this week. The Niners are the safe play, and the Cards are the value play. But I've got another defense in mind. I'm going 100% exposure on the Buffalo Bills. Buffalo's at Miami this week and a 6-point favorite. The Bills are priced at $3,900 on DraftKings and projected for 7.4 fantasy points. The Bills defense had a nice performance in week 1. 1 pick, 1 fumble recovery, and 1 sack. And this week, they get the super juicy matchup against Ryan Fitzpatrick and a lackluster Miami offense. Fitzmagic threw 3 picks last week, so there's going to be some turnover opportunities for Buffalo. Plus, the Dolphins could be without their top wide receiver Devontae Parker. He's got a hamstring injury. The Bills' defense is in a prime spot for another solid fantasy performance this week. You can lock them in. And that's a wrap on the Week 2 DraftKings Fantasy Preview. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF or over on the YouTube at ManFans Fantasy Football Podcast. If you love the show, smash the like button, subscribe to the podcast, and share this episode. Good luck this week. I hope you guys see some green screens, and I'll catch you on the flip side.